You think you're thinking, right now. You believe you're processing information rationally, weighing evidence, reaching conclusions based on logic and reason. But Francis Bacon would tell you something disturbing. You're probably not thinking at all. You're rationalizing. You're confirming what you already believe. You're filtering reality through layers of bias, emotion, and mental shortcuts that have nothing to do with actual thought. And the scariest part? You can't tell the difference. Your brain is so good at creating the feeling of rational thought while actually doing something completely different that you're convinced you're being logical when you're being anything but. This is the problem Bacon dedicated his life to solving. Not how to think more, but how to think clearly. How to cut through the systematic errors and biases that make human thinking unreliable. How to recognize when you're fooling yourself. How to make decisions based on reality rather than comfortable delusions. And he discovered something revolutionary. That clear thinking isn't natural. It's not something that happens automatically when you try to be rational. It requires systematic discipline to fight against your brain's built-in tendencies toward error, bias, and self-deception. So let's break down Francis Bacon's method for thinking clearly and making better decisions. This isn't comfortable. It requires accepting that your natural thinking processes are deeply flawed. But it's the only path to actually seeing reality and making decisions that work in reality rather than in your imagination. The first enemy, the idol of the tribe. Bacon identified 4 categories of systematic thinking errors he called idols. The first is the idol of the tribe, the biases built into human nature itself. These are errors everyone makes because of how human brains are constructed. And recognizing them is the foundation of clear thinking. The human brain wants patterns. Even when patterns don't exist, you see faces in clouds, meaning in randomness, causation and correlation. Your brain is a pattern-matching machine, and it's so good at its job that it finds patterns that aren't there. This makes you see connections and causes where only coincidence exists. Makes you believe you understand things you don't. Makes you confident in conclusions based on insufficient evidence. The human brain wants consistency. When you encounter information that contradicts your existing beliefs, your brain doesn't update the beliefs. It distorts or dismisses the information. Confirmation bias isn't a flaw you have. It's a feature of how human brains work. You literally see evidence that confirms your beliefs more clearly than evidence that contradicts them. You remember supporting information better. You find reasons to dismiss contradicting information, all automatically, without conscious awareness. The human brain wants to be right. When you take a position, your ego becomes invested in that position being correct. This makes objective evaluation nearly impossible. You're not analyzing whether you're right. You're defending the position you've already taken. You're using your intelligence to rationalize rather than think. And the smarter you are, the better you are at creating sophisticated rationalizations that feel like thought but are actually defense mechanisms. Bacon's solution for tribal idols is brutal awareness. You have to accept that your natural thinking is systematically biased, that your brain is lying to you constantly, that feeling certain doesn't mean you're right, that your intuitions are often wrong, that your first instincts need to be questioned. This isn't comfortable. It means doubting yourself constantly. But it's the only way to compensate for biases you can't eliminate. The second enemy, the idol of the cave. These are personal biases, the specific distortions that come from your individual experience, education, personality, and circumstances. Bacon called them cave idols because each person lives in their own cave of perspective, seeing reality only through their particular tunnel of experience. If you're successful, you overestimate the role of merit and underestimate the role of luck, because acknowledging luck would threaten your self-image. If you're struggling, you might do the opposite, overestimating external constraints and underestimating your own agency, because acknowledging agency would require accepting responsibility. If you've invested years in a particular belief system, profession, or relationship, you become biased towards seeing that investment as valuable. Sunk cost fallacy isn't just about money. It's about ego. Admitting you wasted years on something wrong or worthless is psychologically painful, so you convince yourself it was valuable. You double down. You rationalize, all to avoid the pain of admitting wasted time and effort. If you have strong emotions about something, those emotions color every aspect of your thinking about it. You can't separate your analysis from your feelings. You believe you're thinking rationally about topics you're emotional about, but you're actually just generating sophisticated justifications for emotionally driven conclusions. Bacon's method for cave idols is systematic perspective taking. You have to deliberately seek out people who don't share your experiences, your background, your biases. You have to expose yourself to perspectives that make you uncomfortable. You have to question whether your conclusions are actually based on evidence or just reflections of your particular cave. This requires humility most people don't have. The humility to recognize that your perspective is limited and possibly wrong. The third enemy, the idol of the marketplace. These are biases that come from language and social interaction. The marketplace is where people exchange ideas through words, and Bacon recognized that language itself is a source of systematic error in thinking. Words are imprecise. They mean different things to different people. They carry emotional baggage. They create categories that don't perfectly match reality. When you think in words, you're thinking in approximations and distortions. The words available to you limit what you can think. The categories language provides shape how you perceive reality, often in ways that are misleading. Social consensus creates truth-feeling even when consensus is wrong. If everyone around you believes something, you're biased toward believing it too, not because of evidence, but because of social pressure and the assumption that if everyone believes it, there must be something to it. But social consensus is often wrong. Historically, consensus has been wrong about most fundamental questions at most times, yet you're biased toward accepting it anyway. Arguments and rhetoric are designed to persuade, not to reveal truth. When you engage in debate, you're not usually seeking truth. You're seeking to win, to demonstrate that your position is superior. This competitive dynamic makes clear thinking nearly impossible. You're optimizing for victory in argument rather than accuracy in understanding. Bacon's approach to marketplace idols is to be extremely skeptical of language and social proof. When you encounter a confident claim, translate it into concrete, observable facts. What exactly does this mean? What would we observe if it were true? What would we observe if it were false? Strip away the emotional language and social consensus and examine the underlying reality. This is hard work. It's easier to just accept confident claims from trusted sources, but easier doesn't produce clarity. The fourth enemy, the idol of the theater. These are biases from authority and tradition. The theaters are philosophical systems, religious doctrines, ideological frameworks, traditional beliefs, elaborate stories about how the world works that may have no relationship to reality, but that people accept because they're authoritative or traditional. You're biased toward believing experts in fields you don't understand. This is often reasonable, but it can also lead you astray when experts are wrong or biased or operating within flawed paradigms. You trust institutional authority even when that authority has clear incentives to deceive you. You accept traditional wisdom even when that wisdom was based on false assumptions or outdated information. You adopt entire frameworks of thought from authorities without questioning the foundations. You inherit worldviews, political ideologies, religious beliefs, philosophical assumptions, and these frameworks shape all your subsequent thinking without you examining whether the framework itself is valid. You're thinking within a system, never questioning the system itself. Bacon's method for theater idols is the most radical. Question everything, including and especially the fundamental frameworks you inherited. Just because something is old doesn't mean it's wise. Just because someone has credentials doesn't mean they're right. Just because a framework is elaborate and internally consistent doesn't mean it maps to reality. You have to be willing to examine the foundations, the assumptions, the basic premises that everything else is built on. This is terrifying for most people, but it's necessary for clear thinking, the discipline of observation over theory. Once you understand the four idols, the systematic errors that corrupt thinking, Bacon's positive method becomes clear. Stop starting with theories and looking for confirmation. Start with observation and build theories from what you actually see. Most people do it backwards. They have a theory about how something works, usually inherited or emotionally satisfying, and then they look for evidence that supports it. They notice evidence that confirms their theory and ignore or rationalize away evidence that contradicts it. They think they're being empirical, but they're actually just confirming pre-existing beliefs. Bacon insisted on reversing this. Observe first, without preconceptions. Notice what actually happens, not what you expect to happen. Collect data systematically, including especially data that surprises you or contradicts your expectations. Only after extensive observation do you start building theories, and those theories must be held provisionally, subject to revision based on new observations. This is the foundation of the scientific method, but it's also a method for thinking clearly about anything. When you're making a decision, don't start with what you want to be true and look for justification. Start with observation. What's actually happening? What's the evidence? What would someone with no stake in the outcome conclude? Only then do you form judgments. The discipline is fighting your brain's tendency to start with conclusions and work backwards. Your brain wants to reach conclusions quickly, wants to confirm what it already believes, wants to feel certain. Clear thinking requires fighting these tendencies, staying in uncertainty longer, observing more before concluding, being willing to not know while you gather actual evidence. The practice of systematic doubt. Bacon advocated for systematic doubt as a tool for clear thinking. Not cynicism, not refusing to believe anything, but methodical questioning of your own conclusions to test whether they're actually justified or just comfortable. When you reach a conclusion, ask yourself, what evidence would disprove this? If you can't think of anything, you haven't reached a conclusion. You've adopted a belief that's immune to evidence. That's faith, not thought. Clear thinking requires falsifiability. You need to know what would prove you wrong, and you need to actively look for that evidence, not avoid it. Ask yourself, am I believing this because of evidence or because I want it to be true? This is brutally difficult to answer honestly. Your brain is excellent at creating post hoc justifications that make emotionally driven beliefs feel rational. But if you're honest, if you really examine your motivations, you can often detect when you're rationalizing rather than reasoning. Ask yourself, would I believe this if different people or groups held this position? If your belief changes based on who's advocating it rather than what evidence supports it, you're engaging in tribal thinking, not clear thinking. The truth or falsehood of a claim is independent of who states it. But your brain doesn't work that way naturally. You have to force yourself to evaluate claims independent of their source. Ask yourself, what would change my mind? If the answer is nothing, you've moved from thought to dogma. Clear thinking requires being able to specify conditions under which you'd change your position. If you can't do that, you're not thinking. You're defending. And defense is the enemy of clarity. The recognition of cognitive load. Bacon lived before modern cognitive science, but he understood something crucial that's now been proven empirically. Clear thinking is cognitively expensive. Your brain doesn't want to do it. It wants shortcuts. It wants to rely on heuristics, emotions, and quick pattern matching because those are efficient. Clear thinking is inefficient. It's slow, it's exhausting, and your brain will avoid it whenever possible. This means you can't think clearly about everything. You have limited cognitive resources. If you try to think clearly about every decision, every belief, every question, you'll burn out. You have to be strategic. You have to identify what actually matters, where clear thinking will make a significant difference, and focus your limited capacity for genuine thought on those areas. For most decisions, heuristics and shortcuts are fine. You don't need to think clearly about what to have for breakfast. You can use habits and preferences. You don't need to analyze every social interaction deeply. You can rely on social intuitions. Save your capacity for clear thinking for decisions that actually matter. Career choices, major relationships, significant investments of time or money, beliefs that shape your entire worldview. And when you do engage in clear thinking on important questions, recognize it's going to be hard. You're going to feel resistance. Your brain is going to try to take shortcuts. You're going to feel the pull toward comfortable conclusions. That's normal. Clear thinking feels difficult because it is difficult. It's fighting your brain's natural tendencies. If thinking feels easy and comfortable, you're probably not doing it clearly. The strategy of writing for clarity. Bacon was obsessive about writing, not just to communicate, but as a tool for thinking. Because writing forces clarity that thinking alone doesn't. When you write your thoughts, you have to make them explicit. You can't hide behind vague intuitions and feelings. You have to commit to specific claims and specific reasoning. This reveals gaps in your thinking. When you try to write out why you believe something, you often discover you don't actually have good reasons. Or your reasons are circular, or they depend on assumptions you can't justify. Thoughts that seem solid in your head fall apart when you try to write them clearly. And that's valuable information. It tells you your thinking isn't as clear as it felt. Writing also creates distance from your thoughts. When you can read what you wrote yesterday or last week, you can evaluate it more objectively than you can evaluate thoughts you're having right now. You can spot biases and errors more easily. You can see when you were rationalizing versus actually reasoning. You can improve your thinking through iteration in ways that are impossible with thoughts alone. The practice is to write out your reasoning for important beliefs and decisions, not for others necessarily, for yourself as a tool for clarity. When you're making an important decision, write out the factors, the evidence, the reasoning, the assumptions. Force yourself to be explicit. Then read what you wrote. Does it actually justify the conclusion? Or are you reaching the conclusion for other reasons and the written reasoning is just rationalization? This is uncomfortable. You'll often discover that beliefs you were confident about are based on shaky reasoning, that decisions you were sure about aren't as clear-cut as they felt. But that discomfort is valuable. It's your brain being forced to actually think instead of just feeling certain. The acceptance of uncertainty. One of the hardest parts of clear thinking is accepting that most things are uncertain. Your brain hates uncertainty. It wants definitive answers, clear categories, simple explanations, and it will create false certainty to avoid the discomfort of not knowing. This false certainty is the enemy of clear thinking. Bacon insisted on holding beliefs provisionally, on accepting that most conclusions are tentative, subject to revision based on new evidence, on being comfortable saying, "I don't know," or "I'm not sure," or "the evidence is mixed." This feels weak. It feels like you're not thinking clearly if you can't reach definitive conclusions. But the opposite is true. Claiming false certainty is what's unclear. Accepting uncertainty is honest engagement with reality. Clear thinking requires distinguishing between different levels of confidence. Some things you can be very confident about because the evidence is overwhelming. Other things are genuinely uncertain, and you need to acknowledge that uncertainty rather than pretend you know more than you do. Most beliefs should come with implicit probability estimates. "I'm 90% confident this is true," is clearer thinking than "this is definitely true," when you're actually 90% confident. This also means being willing to update. When new evidence arrives, when your predictions turn out wrong, when circumstances change, you need to revise your beliefs. But your brain resists this. Changing your mind feels like admitting you were wrong, which threatens your ego. Clear thinking requires divorcing your ego from your beliefs. Your beliefs are tools for navigating reality, not parts of your identity. When they stop working, you replace them. No ego, no defensiveness, just updating based on evidence. The recognition of emotional contamination. Bacon understood that emotions are the primary enemy of clear thinking. Not because emotions are bad, but because they're so powerful and so invisible. You think you're reasoning objectively when you're actually just generating rationalizations for emotionally driven conclusions. And you can't tell the difference without systematic attention. When you have strong feelings about something, you cannot think clearly about it. Not won't. Can't. Your emotional state fundamentally alters your cognitive processing. You attend to different information. You interpret ambiguous evidence differently. You weight factors differently, all without conscious awareness. You genuinely believe you're thinking objectively, but your emotional state is determining your conclusions. The only solution is recognition and compensation. When you notice strong emotions about a topic, that's a red flag. That's your signal that clear thinking will be nearly impossible. You need to either wait for emotions to subside before making decisions, or you need to systematically compensate by forcing yourself to consider evidence and arguments you're emotionally inclined to dismiss. This is brutally difficult. It requires noticing your own emotional states, which most people are bad at. It requires accepting that your thinking is compromised, which your ego resists. It requires deliberately exposing yourself to uncomfortable information and arguments when your emotions are screaming at you to dismiss them. Most people never develop this capability. They go through life making emotionally driven decisions while believing they're being rational, and they wonder why their decisions don't work out. The practice of seeking disconfirmation. Here's where clear thinking becomes genuinely uncomfortable. You have to actively look for evidence and arguments that contradict what you believe. You have to seek out smart people who disagree with you and actually listen to them. You have to expose yourself to information that threatens your existing beliefs. Because if you only seek confirming evidence, you're not thinking, you're confirming. Most people do the opposite. They seek out information that confirms what they already believe. They follow sources that agree with them. They dismiss or avoid contradicting information. They surround themselves with people who think like them. This feels good. It feels like you're informed and right. But you're actually just reinforcing biases and becoming more certain about things you might be wrong about. Bacon's method requires the opposite. Deliberately seek sources that disagree with you. Read arguments from smart people who hold opposing views. Expose yourself to evidence that contradicts your beliefs. Try to understand the strongest possible case against your position. This is psychologically difficult. It creates cognitive dissonance. It threatens your certainty. But it's the only way to test whether your beliefs are actually justified or just comfortable. And critically, you have to actually engage with this contradicting information, not dismiss it immediately, not look for reasons it's wrong. Actually consider whether it might be right and you might be wrong. Give opposing arguments the most charitable interpretation you can. Try to understand why smart, informed people might reach conclusions different from yours. This is hard. It feels like betraying your own position. But it's necessary for clear thinking. The final discipline: deciding with clarity. All of this systematic doubt, all this recognition of bias, all this seeking of disconfirmation, it's not about paralysis. It's about making better decisions. Once you've thought clearly, once you've examined evidence honestly, once you've tested your reasoning, you still need to decide and act. Clear thinking is a tool for better decisions, not an excuse to avoid deciding. But decisions made after clear thinking are different. They're more tentative, more willing to be revised, more aware of what they don't know, less confident in false certainty. And paradoxically, this makes them better decisions. Because you're not just committing based on comfortable illusions. You're committing based on actual evidence and honest evaluation of uncertainty. You also recognize that most decisions aren't permanent. You can update, you can change course when you get new information. You don't need to be right the first time. You just need to be willing to recognize when you're wrong and adjust. Clear thinking is iterative. It's not about getting to perfect truth. It's about being less wrong over time through honest engagement with evidence and systematic correction of errors. The goal isn't perfect rationality. That's impossible. The human brain is too flawed, too biased, too emotional for perfect rationality. The goal is being less systematically irrational, being aware of your biases and compensating for them, being willing to question yourself, being honest about uncertainty, being willing to change your mind. This is what clear thinking actually looks like. Not certainty, not having all the answers, but honest, disciplined engagement with reality as it actually is, rather than how you wish it were. The cost of clarity. Francis Bacon's method for clear thinking isn't free. It costs comfort. It costs certainty. It costs the pleasant feeling of always being right. It costs the tribal belonging that comes from sharing unquestioned beliefs with your group. It costs the ego satisfaction of feeling smarter than others. These are real costs, and most people aren't willing to pay them. It's easier to stay in comfortable delusions, to believe what you want to believe, to confirm rather than question, to be certain rather than honest about uncertainty, to think you're thinking when you're actually just rationalizing. Most people will choose comfort over clarity, and they'll suffer the consequences in bad decisions based on false beliefs about reality. But some people will choose differently. will recognize that clarity, however uncomfortable, is more valuable than comfortable delusion. That honest uncertainty is more useful than false certainty. That questioning yourself is stronger than defending yourself. That seeing reality as it is, however harsh, is better than living in pleasant fictions. Francis Bacon chose clarity, and it made him one of the most influential thinkers in human history. Not because his conclusions were always right, but because his method for reaching conclusions was revolutionary. He created a systematic approach to fighting the biases and errors that make human thinking unreliable. And that approach, that discipline of clear thinking, that's what separates those who navigate reality effectively from those who stumble through comfortable illusions wondering why nothing works out as they expected. The method is here. The discipline is available. The question is whether you're willing to do the uncomfortable work of actually thinking clearly rather than just feeling certain. That choice determines the quality of every decision you'll make for the rest of your life.